This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is creativity. It's another in my series on creativity. James C. Kaufman is my guest. He's an expert on the nature of creativity, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is creativity. James C. Kaufman is my guest. He has written much on the topic, and as I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, give a little bit of personal background, as well as their interest in the subject. So welcome, James, and if you could tell a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is James Kaufman, and I grew up in a family of psychologists. Both of my parents developed IQ tests, and I was originally wanting to be a creative writer, writing fiction and then turned to plays. And somewhere in the middle of college, I decided to do a double major between creative writing and psychology. Pursued psychology, still not quite knowing what I wanted to do, but decided to go back to my initial love of creative writing and start poking around and studying that. And I've been studying creativity for kind of a long time, about more than 15, 16 years. And it's been kind of a fascinating journey. It's always something different. It's a chance to study stuff that you usually don't get to. And it's always challenging and always something different.
Well, you've written many books, many articles about the subject of creativity. Let me just talk about what I guess one would call the linchpin of your ideas regarding creativity, and that's the 4C model. If you could just give a brief explanation of what the 4Cs are and how they function.
Absolutely. Often when we think of creativity, it's often as big C or genius. So Mozart, Einstein, Beethoven, Shakespeare. And on one hand, that's great. They're absolutely creative, no doubt. Up until about 20 years ago, it was pretty much either people would think of that or they would think of little c, which was everything else. So all types of everyday creativity. And what Ron Beghetto and I began doing and writing about and thinking about over the last 10 years has been to kind of expand this dichotomy between little c and big C, where first we discussed the idea of mini C, or personal creativity. And this is the creativity that happens in the learning process. It's creativity of the sudden insight, or the idea, or the metaphors you understand what you're doing. It's kind of the little mini aha, or wait, I can do that, what if I do that? And it is different than little c, in that little c requires somebody else to say, yes, I think this is creative. We also then kind of kept discussing it that the gap between little c and big C seemed a little bit big, in that there were people who were the creative geniuses, but then if you looked at everything else, what about the people who are clearly experts, are clearly incredibly creative? Maybe they regularly publish novels, or they are the researchers who are, publishing lots of papers, or musicians who are performing all around the world. We don't really know if they're going to be big C yet, and we don't know if they're at that genius level. But to lump them in with people who are still kind of playing around seemed a little imprecise. And we came up with this idea of pro C to kind of recognize a certain level of creative expertise without saying that it had to be absolute immortal genius.
Well, I know I'm going to actually do a show on genius, the idea of genius. I'm always a little unsettled with that idea. The thing that in this culture we get is that the idea that everyone's creative. For example, when I was growing up, it was well acknowledged that there were dumb people out there in the world, that there were dumb kids in class. Now it seems that everything becomes medicalized, that if someone is dumb, they have ADD or ADHD, or they're bipolar, or this or that. And it's sort of the same way when we think of positive things, when we think of a notion of genius or greatness or creativity. I know my wife has sometimes said that to call people, let's say in advertising, as creatives is sort of akin to calling someone an athlete because they walk down their driveway to get their mail, as if they're in the same league as LeBron James as an athlete. Could one of the things I would say is I would think there's a fifth C, and I would call that cleverness. And a lot of people, I think, mistake cleverness, for example, in politics or in leadership or in business. When I hear, for example, Steve Jobs being called a genius, I'm like, he was not the guy. Wozniak was the guy who actually knew the computer stuff. Jobs was a businessman and a mediocre one at that because he almost ran Apple into the ground, but he had a lot of good PR. So when I hear things like Jobs being held up as some kind of a genius or creative. I'm like, well, people don't understand creativity. Granted, he was clever and he knew how to market himself just like a Donald Trump, except in a different area. Uh, do you have you ever dealt with the idea of either any of the four C's versus just cleverness, the ability to push oneself, that simian cleverness?
I mean, I think that that type of cleverness would be reflected a little C in pro C, a lot less so in big C, which is I think a little bit what you're getting at, that to call somebody genius when they're famous, let's say.
Yeah.
And those are very different things. And I mean, some of it is that we use all these terms, we lump them together. So somebody who's famous, you can be famous without being creative.
Yeah.
You know, you can be popular without being creative. It's even with pro C, you can be a pro C actor and not being able to support yourself. You might be doing off Broadway, but you might be able to support yourself as an actor and not be at the pro C level. So maybe you're on a soap opera and making a lot of money, but you're terrible.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people like that. You can be over rewarded.
Yeah.
I mean, by far. And people may treat you like you're big C and really you're kind of little C, pro C. One of the things about big C is that I've always felt that it's a very retrospective thing, in that if you go back to the 1800s, the writers and the artists and the musicians who at that time people would say, yes, this person will be remembered forever, most of them we've never heard of them. Whereas some of the people back then who we might have said, oh, they're just a passing fancy. I mean, that's Charles Dickens, that's Mark Twain. I mean, people loved Charles Dickens' work. They were excited about it. Nobody thought it was like highbrow literature. And yet, today, we feel like we can make those same type of guesses about the people who, even the same people who dismiss J.K. Rowling or Stephen King as being, well, people like them so they can't be genius. I mean, I don't know if they're genius or not. But I'm very curious in 100 years, will people still be reading Harry Potter or will it be a footnote? Will people still be reading whoever won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012?
Well, that brings up the idea of objectivity. When you talk about, for example, Harry Potter, the obvious cultural marker would be the Oz books of Frank L. Baum, and really only the first one or two books are read, and that's children's literature. I did a show with a fellow a few weeks ago that kicked off talking about Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. I mean, to me, that's a joke. Anyone, songwriting, lyrics are dependent upon the mood, inflicted by, put upon it by the music and whatnot. But so, do you think that, from what it sounds like, from what you said in a couple of times here, is that you think that you can't judge someone who's greatly creative until time has passed? For example, if Moby Dick hadn't been published and was sitting in a footlocker for 160 years and discovered suddenly, it wouldn't have become great until it's published. I mean, I would argue that there's imminent greatness and there are factors, and people may not, and a lot of critics may not understand what makes a great poem great. They'll just like something, and people confuse that. So, are you more on the cultural approbation side of what people think is creative?
I'm, I'm saying that the big C level genius is in the creativity that we would consider a different level. I think that takes time to figure out how future generations are going to view it. I think if we're talking simply what is creative, I think is perfectly okay to assess, try to assess or rate. I think that people tend to agree a lot more than you might think about lower level creativity. So if I were to take 300 poems written by high school students and have people with enough background in poetry or teaching high school read all of them and kind of say, these are the more creative ones, these aren't as creative, they agree at a much higher rate than I ever would have guessed, which surprised me at first. So I think it's absolutely possible to rate creativity while it happens. I think it's certainly possible to rate or judge big C creativity as it happens. There's just a note of caution, I would say. That, I mean, take, for example, the Bob Dylan and the Nobel Prize. It depends what we see the Nobel Prize is there for. I mean, some of the other winners who've won it recently are people who, I mean, and again, not to confuse fame with creativity, but several of the winners are people who nobody outside of a very small group of people have read.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're less or more creative, but is the purpose of the Nobel Prize to highlight the best writers, to highlight the best writers who people read, to highlight the writers who will be remembered forever, or is it a political thing that has its own logic and manipulations and politics and backstabbings and things like that as any other rule?
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at the Nobel, it's clearly pushes what would be called a liberal or progressive agenda. Just as, for example, Oscars have become basically public relations machines. You know, look in the last 20 years, how many young up and coming actresses who work in flimsy little films win an Oscar versus a 60 or 70-year-old counterpart woman who's in an art film and maybe gives a true performance that someone's going to notice in 50 years. I mean, the last 20 years you've seen the starlet of the moment gets their time. But I want to talk a bit about the idea of prodigies, because when we talk about creativity, the thing that probably comes to most people's mind is the Mozart effect, sort of the genius, someone who's just born with something. At the age of 5 or 6, they can do this or that, or they think of a young Einstein, didn't have to work at it and whatnot. But the thing that's with prodigies that if you look at them, you know, because every few years you'll see in the media, there's a new mini Mozart or a pint-sized Picasso, some little child who dabbles paint on a canvas. It sells for $1 million a canvas, and then 5 years later, they're doing nothing, and you find out the kid ended up a vagrant under the Golden Gate Bridge, you know, 20 years later. What do we know about prodigies? Because it seems to me that prodigies aren't necessarily more creative than people who mature at a consistent rate with the rest of the population. It seems they just top out more quickly. Am I correct in that, or have you researched that?
From what I know, certainly prodigies tend to only occur in a few fields, and a lot of them aren't really fields that, I mean, like chess. Chess requires, obviously, you got to be smart. I don't know if I would call that inherently a creative field. I mean, I'm sure it involves creativity. It doesn't necessarily strike me as the most creative of fields. They tend to be in certain domains where the rules and mechanisms are more easily figured out. So there's a reason why there are no prodigies in the area of nuclear physics.
Yeah.
Because you got to go to school for years and years and just to be able to understand it, let alone to pose new ideas. And doing something young doesn't mean doing something better. You know, It can, but not always. You know, being able to go to college at age 12 doesn't mean you're a better college student than the 18-year-old.
Yeah.
Just that you're younger.
The Doogie Howser effect, someone once coined it, after the old TV show.
I remember. No, it's I mean, part of it also is what is called a prodigy in the press doesn't necessarily mean an actual prodigy. I mean, often if you look at the really, really young kids who are pushed to college, okay, well, what role do their parents play in pushing them and targeting it? They tend to go to smaller colleges, you know, colleges that maybe are more willing to want the publicity of taking in a 9-year-old freshman. I I mean, certainly it's not like I am not aware of many studies that show that prodigies go on to do that level over a career. You know, it's not like if we look at the top people in the world right now that we're all prodigies. It's usually a mix.
Yeah, it's sort of like I've read about what we call the valedictorian effect too, is that the kids who are the valedictorians in their junior highs or their high schools or their colleges are the kids that apply themselves, study hard for the very limited function of learning how to pass this test, how to pass that test, but that doesn't translate into real world success in any way because most valedictorians, from what I've read, and it could be apocryphal, but from what I've read, most people have said that they do no better and sometimes a little bit worse than your average student.
I mean, I don't know the specifics of valedictorians, but it's the same reason why the SATs, the GREs are kind of limited. I mean, they give some information, but mostly they show how a student do in their first year of college. They don't talk about who's going to go on 30 years from now to actually do something really good. They're related, but mostly because they're related to basic intelligence. They're used because they're easy.
Yeah. A lot of people, as I said, believe that everyone is inherently creative, and I would guess that would fall onto your small C model. You know, learning how to tie your shoelaces might seem creative the first time you do it, but it becomes a rote thing after many years. Writing a great sonnet isn't like tying your shoelaces. There was a Woody Allen film back in the late 70s, his first drama called Interiors, and there was a character played by an actress, Mary Beth Hurt, called Joey. She had a sister who was a poet, another sister who was an actress, and she sort of declared in one of the scene's best films how she has all the angst and anxieties of an artist, but none of the talent. And that's one of the things that I've seen in my 3+ decades in the arts, is that most of the people who think that they're artists are really mistaking their higher sensitivity, emotional sensitivity levels, because most artists are more highly emotionally sensitive than your average plumber or banker. And they then think that, well, because they have that one quality, that means they must have the creativity as well. But that's certainly not true in my experience. What have you found about people's emotional links and their desire to feel good about themselves and feel creative when they're really not? Because we seem to have a culture now that values more how people feel rather than what they actually do, in their lives.
I mean, certainly people want to believe in the mad genius idea.
Yeah.
People want to believe it. Whether or not it's true, and it's probably not particularly true, in part because if somebody isn't creative, then they can at least say, well, at least I'm not crazy. And if they are creative and having issues, they can at least I benefit from it. At least I'm getting something from it. And the problem is that it's kind of like, it's not very different than a lot of things that people link with creativity. So ADHD is often linked with creativity. They have common symptoms.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're necessarily highly related. So it's the same way with a lot of different mental disorders or emotional disorders, in that some of the things they have in common, such as hypersensitivity or often what's called sensory leakage, so like synesthesia, or like hearing smells type stuff, or really wanting novelty, or what's the other one, or like almost risk taking, sensation seeking. These are associated with some mental disorders. They're also associated with creativity, but it doesn't mean that they're all linked together.
Yeah.
So people may have this stuff and say, well, I'm acting like a creative person, I should be creative. It doesn't mean they will be.
Yeah.
It's also kind of going back to the 4C level. Just because you have the creativity at a certain level certainly doesn't mean you're going to be a genius. I mean, the word creative genius is thrown out way too much.
Yeah.
Whenever there's a study that looks at creativity, usually it's in college students. And then the headlines say, to be a creative genius, and even the authors have never said that. A lot depends on why you want to be creative. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in creativity that you don't need to be a genius for. I mean, there's a lot of nice, everyday, with genius, you're starting to change the playing field.
Well, the problem with genius, as I see it, I believe in the small g genius in the sense that someone may have a genius for words, or a genius for music, or a genius for the application of mechanical principles. Uh, but the idea of the big G genius, someone like an Einstein, to me just seems nuts because, for example, I've read Einstein's books. His most famous popular science book was called Ideas and Opinions. And his ideas about humans, human society, the way humans are, he was very clueless. I mean, he functions at a what I would call an Oprah Winfrey level view of the universe. There's no depth, there's no complexity. He can be great with numbers or whatnot, but he has a very thin, shallow understanding of what makes human beings and what motivates them. In a sense, for example, even though I'm not the greatest fan of Bill Clinton, someone like Clinton understood what makes people tick. And one could say he had a genius for politics, whether he could enact policies or whatnot, versus his wife. Clearly, he was far, far more talented than she was. But someone like Einstein seemed to be totally missing. He was off in that corner, dealing with his numbers, dealing with his abstraction, his mind experiments. So he was great in that way. But if you tried to get Einstein to sit on a local municipal board to determine the best social policy for the next 10 years, you might as well just pick a wino off the street.
And what you're talking about is actually very much backed up by research, the idea of domain specificity.
Yeah.
Which is that you could be really creative in math. Doesn't mean you'll be creative in English.
Right.
You could be really creative in music. Doesn't mean you're going to be a creative cook. Like, there's no reason of thinking that.
Yeah.
And yet people assume that, well, you're just creative.
Yeah.
And yet there's no reason why people who are good in even 3 areas, let's say, are going to be notably smart or creative or accomplished in a different random 3.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is that we often think in a general view. So we'll think of somebody as being smart or creative or genius, and then we assume they know everything about something.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when you get stuff like, think about Jenny McCartney and the anti-vax stuff.
Yeah. Because she looks good naked in Playboy, she must know what she's talking about.
And it's exactly.
I want to talk a little bit about intuition, and I want to bring up another idea that was first propagated by the poet John Keats. And the term has often been misused, and the idea is called negative capability. That is the ability to see connections between things that other people can't see. But once that connection has been made by the person who can see it, other people, the light bulb sort of goes on and say, oh, that makes sense. And that's something that I think the really great, whether it's in science or art or the leaders, the people who can make connections between things that other people just gloss over, that seems to be an innate ability. Or because I don't think I've ever encountered anyone who can learn it. You can learn, for example, to write. You can open up a Chicago manual or manual style and learn to write a good business letter, but you can't really learn to write prose like Melville. You can't be taught to be, Whitman or Rainer Maria Rilke or a great poet. You can't. You can take a lump of clay and whatnot, but if you don't have the dexterity, you're never going to be Rodin or Michelangelo. So. What are your ideas about intuition or intuitive natal ability?
I think it's an interaction in that certainly there are some things that, like, there's one theory that says that if you practice enough, you'll be able to do something. So if you practice for 30 years, then you will reach this level. I'm a little more skeptical of that. I know I could be, fielding grounders the rest of my life. I'm never going to play shortstop for the Yankees.
Yeah.
But I also think that the impact of things like what are sometimes called affordances, so just access to stuff. So you may have an innate ability with words, but if you don't have somebody to encourage it, if you don't have access to even things like have free time to write. If you're working 15 hours a day as a child, you're not going to develop it. If you don't have books to read, teachers, if you don't have people who will encourage your work, you're never going to develop. The same way, if you don't have the drive to keep trying, if you don't have that motivation, that need to keep going, you're going to give up because it's hard to do this stuff. I would see it as a mix between the stuff that you're lucky enough to get, the stuff in the environment, and then how you connect it, your own mix of personality, motivation, and skills and preferences and persistence. It's hard.
Yeah. Well, you made a good point, and you used a good metaphor, the sports metaphor, of saying that you couldn't, be Derek Jeter, basically, if no matter whether you spend 50 years learning to field grounders. I'm never going to be a good singer. I can write great sonnets, but I can't sing a note, and there's nothing that I can do. I don't have the vocal coordination. But I think that with sports, when someone hits a home run, it's easily seen. It goes over the fence. When Tom Brady or Peyton Manning throws a beautiful spiral and it's a touchdown, it's easy to see. When Wayne Gretzky would, dazzle and zip past guys and make go, you could see exactly what he did because you could slow it down in slow motion and see that, he decoyed to the left and went right or whatnot. But how, for example, someone like Goya painted one of his great paintings, or how, Stanley Kubrick, why he did this scene in 2001 or that scene in The Shining, and when some other filmmaker would have done something else. There's a deeper mystery to it because these are things that are going on internally. It's not the physicality. But I have heard people, for example, call Michael Jordan a genius with a basketball, and I just, when I hear that it seems to me like they don't seem to understand the difference. Do you think that physical capability or talent, physical talent, is sort of a twin, is sort of like the other half of the internal creativity, or do you think there's a closer relation?
I think if something is just based on being some type of, somebody who's 7'8" will be better in basketball, I feel like that's kind of one situation. I think that for some athletes, there is a certain improvisation in the moment that goes beyond physical, that's instinctual, that's, whether or not to steal the base, whether, what pitch to throw, what pass to throw, that almost strategy, improvisation, instinct of, if I, move 1 inch to the left, it'll be, a better shot. That's in the moment. I think the in the moment stuff, the stuff that really is decision making, even though it might happen in 0.001 seconds, that I think you can make a pretty good argument that there are some people who are here, some people who are here, which is why they're the players who have the amazing natural talents, but always seem to miss their potential. So I think you could make an argument for that type of a genius. I think if it's just a matter of, somebody's hands are twice as big as anybody else, that's more of, you got lucky.
Yeah. I want to. There's a quote, and it's in several versions, and it may be apocryphal or not. I'm not sure. And its utterer, Thomas Edison, has become a controversial figure in science, almost sort of the way he was revered when I was a child, the way Columbus was, and both of them are sort of in disrepute because Edison has been seen sort of as a predator on the real creative people that he employed. But his most famous quote is probably the one that's either 10% or 1% of genius is inspiration, and either 90 or 99% of it is hard work. And I think there's a certain truth to that. I think you have to have, though, the natal capacity, because, as I said, or as you said, no amount of work is going to make you great in something if you just don't have the ability for it. What do you think of that idea, though? because I think it's certainly true. You have to write. You're not going to be able to write a great sonnet at 7. You're not going to be able to paint the way, as I mentioned, Goya or any other great painter did, just by picking up and slathering paint, no matter how much natal talent you have. Uh, what is your take on that Edison idea?
I mean, inspiration is overrated. I mean, it's people have this fantasy of how they want creativity to be. The muse speaks to you, you get the idea, and then fast forward and boom, there it is. But most of creativity is the same reason why most of the headlines of "do this and be a creative genius," have a messy desk or whatever. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, what the real answer is boring, because it's just work really hard and keep doing it, and get good feedback, figure out how to listen to it, keep trying, abandon things when they're clearly not the way to go, keep pursuing. It's so much of a mix of both persistence, of being given the opportunity, of taking the opportunity, of not giving up. I mean, it's the actual part that is the insight, the thunderbolt. I mean, that's the part that is perhaps the least important. I mean, without it, it makes the big C an awful lot harder. But if you just have the thunderbolt, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, another quote that's been attributed to many painters, and I don't know which one actually said it or if any of them said it, was basically someone asked a famous painter once, "How could you paint a masterpiece in 4.5 hours or 3 hours, whatever it was?" And the guy said, "Well, it took me 50 years to learn how to paint a masterpiece in 3 hours." And again, it's probably an apocryphal quote, but that's one of the things that I think people don't understand about creativity too. There's a famous idea called the writer's block for writers, and I've often said to people, though, you can just take a walk outside into a park and you'll find dozens of stories, dozens of poem ideas if you just look around. There's a guy limping. There's a young mother at the table with her baby. There are two kids fighting over there. There's an old man reading a book. Each of them has an idea or a story, but the idea of writer's block. I knew, for example, a fellow named George Dickinson. He was an actor. He used to be on the show Hill Street Blues, and he also wrote, and he had like a 25-year writer's block or something. Uh, and I could just never understand how that could be. What do you think about these things? It's not just writer's block, but obviously other creative people sometimes will go through these periods where they wax and wane. Um, how does real life, in essence, a divorce, losing a job, getting a bad diagnosis medically, how does that affect creativity? Have you researched that?
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely an impact. It's the same way that writer's block often is not getting ideas, but having something that is preventing you from expressing them, which um, could be psychological, could be fear often. Um, it's certainly, real life happens, and that, for example, as much as we like to connect creativity and mental illness, if you actually look at it, the people who did have mental illness and were creative were still more productive when the illness was at bay and was not particularly dominating. I mean, it's like, on one hand, being in tumultuous times can give you inspiration, so to speak, but if you don't have the freedom to think and write and develop ideas, whether that's because you have to work 15 hours a day, or it's because you're in crippling pain most of the day, or it's because you're in a regime that is silencing things, then it's that much harder to express it. And there was something else you said before the writer's block. What was the first quote you said before the writer's block?
Oh, well, I mean, there was the Edison quote.
The years of knowledge. The other thing that people creativity is so dependent on knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, so when we talk about in the schools and creativity, it's, well, where's the time to teach creativity? But that's not what we're talking about. In that, it's not that you would teach creativity as much as allow it. And so if you're teaching math, it's not, okay, now let's be creative in math and dance our numbers, as much as how many different ways are there to reach this answer. It can be something as simple as that. It's not a matter of a song and a dance. It's just multiple ways of getting the solution for you.
Well, I think that's one of the problems. As schools, you can't really teach creativity. I mean, I think the problem comes with that school is basically about learning basic precepts and principles to live. You need to know how basic mathematics function. You need to know the basics of language. You need to have a syllabus, at least, of history and the softer social sciences. But you can't teach someone how to, like how to write a great short story or what. You can teach them how to write an essay, how to write a standard book report. Is that asking the wrong question of schools then, to try to ask them to teach creativity?
I think it's that when you're teaching those basic facts, there are ways you can teach it that kill creativity or that nurture creativity. So if you're teaching history and you have students vomit back out the answers, that's not encouraging creativity. If you're teaching history and have many different ways that students can show that they understand, I mean, a student could write a mock diary of somebody living in colonial America and demonstrate all the stuff we want them to learn, and yet do it in a way that makes it more interesting and engaging for them and lets them be a little creative. If you're doing, let's say you're teaching basic math concepts and you're just teaching equations, even something as simple as, there's this one way to solve the problem versus how many ways can you solve the problem. I mean, it's not that you're teaching you're not teaching creativity, but you're encouraging it, and you're saying that you can use your creativity as you learn.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years, and it seems to me obvious, although when I mention it to people, they're like, I never thought of it that way, is that one of the hallmarks of greatness, let's say, and I prefer that over genius, but if you want to use having a genius in the arts, is that it's individuated. One cannot mistake the prose of Whitman, or rather Melville, for, say, Mark Twain. One cannot mistake Van Gogh for a Goya. One cannot mistake Mozart for Stravinsky. And when you look at most of the stuff today, like infamously online, people don't call themselves even creative anymore. They're content providers, as if everyone is their own personal Associated Press when I think of that. What do you think about creativity and individuation? Because to me, when you look at great artists, they are, in a sense, non-pareil and they are unique. You can't mistake Emily Dickinson for any other poet, good, bad, or indifferent.
I think a lot's by domain, in that it's truly arts, but in the sciences, in technology, you need to work as a team. You need to work as a group. I think it's interesting, for example, that if you were to name the 10 advances that most impact our lives, the cell phone, who invented the internet, for that matter? I mean, it was the groups of people. It was this team. It was this, cluster of people. And it was. I mean, maybe people can remember the two guys who did Google, but who did YouTube? Who did any of them? Who did Twitter? I mean, I think that in the arts there is that aspect of individual voice, but I would say it's less creative than aesthetic, if that makes sense. Like, it's a very arts dependent thing, whereas I think in the sciences, even in business, I mean, yes, there's some individuality, but so much else is all about groups and teamwork and working together. I'm not sure that fully answers the question. I'm not sure how much it gets what we were trying to get at, but I guess I feel like way that creativity is kind of advancing in this century, the art still allows that, and most of the rest is designed not to, in a sense.
Well, let me put this forth to you. I've made a distinction when I talk with people about art and science. I said that art is more creative and science is discovery, and that artists use little moments of discovery to unfold their own worlds creatively, where scientists use little moments of creativity to discover what's already there. And I'll admit I'm biased, but I think that's why art, I think, is the highest pursuit that man has, because science is already out there. If you remove Darwin, you still have Wallace and you have other people. We'd still have the theory of evolution. If you removed Edison, you still have Tesla and Marconi, and so on and so forth. But if you remove Melville, there's no Moby Dick. There's no chance you'll ever have any book that's even remotely like Moby Dick. If you removed Emily Dickinson, there's no other woman in the 19th century English writing world that's going to have anything remotely Dickinsonian, pro or con. So I think there's a contingency when you talk about groups working together that bolsters that idea. Scientists, in a sense, are following general trends, whereas an artist like, say, Walt Whitman with poetry, he totally broke the mold. He's a total bottleneck. Without Whitman, he totally changed the game. What do you think about that difference between art and science?
I mean, a couple of thoughts. One is that you could also argue there might not be Moby Dick, but current literature wouldn't necessarily be that different. It would be missing a branch. It would be missing this, pathway. But is there any one artist who, if you remove generations later, the field would still be different? Probably. There are a couple. Probably not that many. I mean, think about when we lost all the works of almost all the ancient Greeks when they destroyed the library of I mean, this great work existed, and it was gone. Literature still went on. Literature still continued. It may have taken a couple of steps backwards. I think that we know this better for literature because more people can understand and recognize literature than scientific papers. I mean, if you were to, take creativity research. I mean, yes, as a field we're going this way, we've discovered this stuff. If you were to eliminate certain people in the field, we would have eventually gotten there. But the field would have been missing something the same way the field of 19th century poetry was missing something if one of the poets wasn't there. There are just fewer people who look at it at that level in any individual science. People often will do hierarchies of the disciplines, which I am more hesitant to do. Because, for one thing, in most of the hierarchies, the humanities is always at the bottom, and pure mathematics on top, which I don't particularly agree with either.
Let me ask you about something that you had coined, the Sylvia Plath effect, and it might even be better, I think, to have coined it the sort of romantic poets effect, since they preceded her by a century or more. But talk to me about what the term is, for those who don't know how you define it.
It's a good example of what both the media and general population can do if you're not careful. The basic study is very simple, which was just looking at different writers. And so first I found that if you look at great writers, female poets were more likely to have signs of mental illness than any other type of writer. Then I looked at eminent women and found poets more likely than other writers and actresses and artists and businesswomen and politicians. It was frankly kind of a small finding. It became interpreted as meaning either poets are crazy, or creative writers are crazy, or all creative people have mental illness. It also looked at people who were really well known, and the people who would particularly be interested in it were often little C writers who it really wasn't really about little C. If anything, I mean, a lot of the work I've done has been more on creativity and mental health, on more the positive stuff, because I feel like this little bit was misinterpreted, and on one hand, it's kind of cool to have 5 or 6 like rock songs called the Circuit Black Effect, but it is kind of, I unintentionally, or at least in retrospect, glamorized something that isn't that glamorous. And if that makes, I mean, if because this will be a Plath effect, younger female poets are thinking they're more prone to mentally ill, then that's not what it means, and it kind of shows how good intentions don't always translate to good results.
Well, let me throw this out. You mentioned poets, and certainly I talked about, or I mentioned the Romantic poets, and you can find Van Gogh, and you can find other arts. But I think one of the reasons that poets, especially, have gotten that stereotype, and just in the last century in America, there was Hart Crane and Sylvia Plath and John Berryman and Robert Lowell, just to name some of the biggest names that did themselves, and Sexton as well, that did themselves in. Um, yet, if you look at actresses, you mentioned actresses. Someone very famously like Joan Crawford was clearly had mental problems, and she was at her best a very good actress, if not a great actress. But the thing is that Joan Crawford was a star. She needed that craving. She got that craving early on, and as her fame and age took away her looks and whatnot, she needed it more. She probably did beat her children, as claimed in the Christina Crawford book. Where someone like Sylvia Plath, while she's now a mega poet name, that's mostly because of the fact that her husband was a borderline psychopath. That their story became sort of a twisted, dark Romeo and Juliet caution for others. And that her poetry was great seems to be sort of an addendum. And so I think the idea of public approbation is something that is never accounted for, because a lot of great artists, I mentioned Hart Crane, until a recent movie done by James Franco a few years ago, probably even people outside of poetry, very few would have known of him. Whereas again, Joan Crawford was known by multiple 100,000 times more people knew about her, and subsequently her issues as an artist. What do you think the levels of public approbation that are accorded to certain arts, such as the novelist, the actress, the sculptor, the poet that's toiling in obscurity? How does that play into creativity and depression today?
Certainly, there's an interaction with personality. So, if you have an actor who becomes a superstar but is incredibly introverted, that will cause stress. Most actors tend to be extroverted, and probably likely for that reason. I think that if you're somebody who feeds off compliments and who wants reassurances and people to say good things about you, fame, if it is consistent, can be a healthy, positive thing. If the other thing is that being successful in certain areas, like acting, brings money, brings a certain amount of not having to worry about certain things in life. Whereas if you're a struggling poet trying to figure out how you're going to support yourself, that's its own area. I mean, that's its own thing that causes added stress and anxiety. And I mean, certainly the fact that poets tend not to get rewarded. Poets tend to not be paid a living wage. I mean, that certainly could increase things like anxiety and stress and things that would cause and lead to other things.
Let me talk to you about the idea of organic creativity. I've heard this term over the last 20 years, and it's sort of hand in hand, and maybe just be a kind of silly thing that's riding the idea of organic foods, but I think there's something to it. The idea being that instead of having following patterns or reading books on this is how you write a competent sentence or whatnot. Uh, Organic creativity is the idea that basically you have something that flows out of a natural experience and it's expressed in a natural way, whether or not it conforms to whatever the norms or the parameters of that discipline is. And I guess it could be scientific research. Have you looked into ideas of the people who would call, I guess, organic creativity versus more, I guess you would call, I don't know, prefab or more structured creativity?
I mean, the danger is that, I think you have to know the rules to break them. I think that if you're somebody who knows grammar and spelling and basic things like that, and you're choosing to break the rules on purpose, that's one thing. But if you don't know the rules and you're breaking them out of ignorance, I don't necessarily think that's a positive thing. I think that if creativity is something to be shared and experienced by others, there has to be some level of taking that natural experience that you've had and making it palatable and interesting for others. It doesn't mean you want to do a cookie cutter, story, but there's a reason why there tends to not be that for science.
I could give lots of examples, but I'll stick with one in the arts in particular, and that's abstract expressionism in painting. When you had just recently just mentioned about breaking the rules and knowing them, I think of people like Jackson Pollock and de Kooning and Mark Rothko and whatnot. And when you look at their early works, one of the things that jumps out is that they were totally generic. When they did figurative painting, there was nothing unique about them. I remember looking at Jackson Pollock's paintings and I said, oh, that's okay, it's solid. It reminds me a lot of Adolf Hitler's paintings. Then when you look at his drip paintings, and I'm not a fan. I think it's one of the great frauds perpetrated on art, and it's done so obviously, I think, for money. Or if you look at Rothko with his single color paintings, uh, here you get what is often called authorial intent, but they're breaking the rules, but they're not doing anything, and you get sort of this cult of people who promote this. And yes, certainly Pollock knew the rules of figuration and good painting and whatnot, but his work, from what I've read online and in a number of magazine articles, or I should say abstract expressionist painting, are the most, uh, it's estimated that up to almost 50% of all the paintings out there that are considered abstract expressionist masterpieces are forgeries done by other people because they're so damned easy to do, and the experts are fooled because there is no inherent thing to hold on to. Like, as I said, you can tell an Emily Dickinson poem from a Walt Whitman poem, but anyone can drip paint. And so let me ask you about something like that, and I could talk about postmodernism in writing, but I want to stick with the painting since that's visual, and like with sports, it's more easy to, I guess, grasp for the viewer or listener. What is your idea about something like that, breaking the rules, but yet doing so in such an inane and manner that's so easily duplicated that it doesn't really take that much?
I think intent matters. I think you have to have something to say. You need both of it. So you could, when Alexander Fleming kind of stumbles across penicillin, if it had been the average person, you or me, who did it, we wouldn't have known what to do with that. He did, which is what takes it a step further. I feel like it's why you always get the guerrilla artists who throw bananas against a wall and they sell it for millions of dollars. it doesn't mean that that's great art. It's a gimmick, and it's not.
It's gimmick art.
Yeah, I mean, I view a lot of that stuff as.
Well, there was the fellow who did the infamous piss Christ. He urinated in a jar and then threw a crucifix. This is an act that is supposedly political art, but this is it's got the intent of a 3-year-old. You know, I don't like Christians and whatnot, and I'm not religious. I don't want to get into religion, but it's basically bumper sticker art. It's such a simplistic notion.
I think it's also that stripping fame and pop culture from actual creativity, where there are things that get a great deal of attention because they're controversial or by somebody famous. I mean, if Tom Cruise published a book of poetry, more people would read that than have read the last 20 Pulitzer Prizes in poetry. That doesn't mean it's good poetry, you know. I think that things have become famous or renowned or expensive for many reasons that have nothing to do with creativity at all, or quality for that matter. So I've heard of the Piss Christ. I don't know the details about it. Maybe it's creative, maybe it's not. But the fact that we've heard of it is almost irrelevant. You know, we're discussing it for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality or creativity of the art.
Well, let's end this interview. I'll have a final segment where I'll give you a final say, but let me just sort of ask a final question in this segment, and that is that when you give lectures or whatnot to businessmen or whatnot, do you find yourself sometimes feeling like a fish out of water? Because for many people, including me, business is sort of the ultimate domain of cleverness. When we think of robber barons, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, and even to modern people like I mentioned, the Jobses and the Gateses and the guys who created Google. I mean, we don't really think, and I think it's correct, as a public, we don't really think of them that they're going to be known in 1,000 years or 500 years the way Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo were. So do you ever feel that sort of you're preaching to the wrong choir when you're talking about creativity?
I mean, I think there's huge individual variation. I mean, I think that businesses are more likely to want a quick fix, which is why so many creativity consultants often say things that are just not backed up by research. I mean, the whole idea of businesses having all their workers paint for a day thinking will translate to more creative, that's absurd. I think that if a business cares enough to actually want to go and hunt down a researcher as opposed to somebody who's marketing themselves as a creativity consultant, then they're more likely to actually care. I think that, there are some businesses that are very sincere and genuine and want to do creative, innovative, good work. There are an awful lot who aren't, but the ones who aren't tend not to ever contact me. It's the same way that most of the schools that contact me are ones that won't fit the standard mold because somebody there cares about creativity. I don't know. I think that Bill Gates has just as good a chance of being remembered generations from now as anybody else. I don't know. It's so much depends on how our culture and society continues to advance. Do we continue doing stuff more and more and more digitally online in this mode where will all poetry someday be 140 characters long, for God's sakes? If we go back long ago, how many writers from 700 or 800 years ago do we still know? Most of the people we come up with are still last 200-300 years.
Yeah.
So there are a couple.
The Ozymandias effect. Only the really great ends up. Each one gets winnowed down. Well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, I'll just give you a few minutes to just wrap up any thoughts, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with James Kaufman. His website is jamesckaufman.com. I'll link to it below this video. You can look there to contact him or look up anything that he's written or is doing. Let me just ask a couple of questions to end this, and then give you a final say. Do we, human culture in general and in the West, do we really value creativity, or do we just give it lip service, do you think?
I think we want creativity to be something it's not. I mean, I think that
Which
we
is
want
what? What do we want it to be?
something that can be done on cue, something that can
Okay.
be done as a subordinate, habitual type thing, like as in be creative and fix my sink,
Yeah.
as opposed to be,
A
as opposed to
cultural panacea.
right. I mean, we want a certain thing from creativity that sometimes it can do, sometimes it can't, and we don't always want the things that come with it, such as, creative kids can be disruptive or a pain in the ass. Creative workers can not have attention to detail or do things their own way that maybe isn't what you want. So we want the benefits without wanting any of the negatives.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things, almost all the research on creativity is all about how to increase creativity. And the thing I'd love to see more of is work on what creativity leads to. So we all take kind of for common wisdom, oh, well, a company that's more creative will make more money. And profit, yes. But we don't have quite as many studies showing that as I do. Are creative people more successful? I'd love to have more proof. And that way, well, look, this is why it's important. We have this proof that if you are creative, then that, you'll be happier. We have a couple of studies, we have this stuff, but it's very small. I'd also love to see better measures. Yeah. We're still, by and large, using measures we developed 50 years ago, and they're fine. But we can do better. We can do more. We don't, as a society, value something until we measure it. I mean, think about how important the SATs and GREs are. It's not that we necessarily think that they measure the most important thing, but we know what they measure, and what they measure, they do consistently. Yeah. And so it becomes this incredibly important thing for getting into college. If you had a measure of creativity that was as easy to give as the GREs or SATs, and we knew it measured, this, then creativity would have more impact in society right there.
Yes, the law of unintended consequences. We assume that if everyone could be creative, it would be good. But ultimately, what makes a creative, and especially a great creative, or a large C, I believe, as you call it, stand out, is the fact that he stands out. So you have to have the plumbers, and you have to have the people who are going to be the bricklayers, and who are going to do the menial things. It's sort of like with fame. People think that fame is the end all and be all, but unless you've done something for it, it's just mere celebrity. But anyway, let me just then ask you then, what does the future hold for you personally in the next few years in terms of your own research and anything you're working on? And over the next few decades, let's say of your lifetime, where do you think the research on creativity is going, pro or con?
So one of the things that most interests me research-wise is the idea of creativity and equity. Can we use creativity to help social justice? Can we use creativity to kind of help right some of the wrongs that are out there? Ranging from, on one level, they've started using more creative tactics in fighting things like terrorism. Mm-hmm. On other levels, if you look at racism, bigotry, can we use creativity to provide more opportunities for people? Can you use creativity to help bring out the best in people? I think that that's something in particular that particularly excites me over the next several years. I've been kind of forming a little research team and talking about this stuff. Also, I've always loved creative writing. Working on a book on creativity in theater, and still kind of dipping my hands as a playwright here and there. And I'd love to see creativity measurement catch up with technology. I think that wouldn't just be
Before and let me just ask you, what are your takes on artificial intelligence? We've got things now like Google Glasses, which seem to have failed, but it's probably likely by the end of this century, if not sooner, that we're going to be able to have sort of maybe artificial plugins where we're going to be able to download the Encyclopedia Britannica into our minds, in a sense. Do you think that will be? To me, that's one of those things that I think was a law of unintended consequences, thing that's going to be a problem, because I could see that for some people it might be a benefit. For other people's, it might exacerbate mental problems to a degree we can't even imagine. What is your idea about artificial intelligence and its application in humans' creativity?
Certainly, there will be unintended and potentially negative consequences. I think there is a possibility for amazing things. I mean, I think that a lot depends on how it's done. A lot depends on the creativity of the people who are currently using AI and gearing AI. I mean, I know a lot of people find it scary, whereas to me, it's a tool. The same way that an airplane isn't inherently scary. It can be scary if it's crashing, and it can be miraculous if it's suddenly taking you to Paris in 6 hours. But it's a possibility, and I think with AI as a possibility, I think that I think it's really exciting. I'm cautious, but it'd be exciting as hell.
Well, jamesckaufman.com is James's website. If you've enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about him there. I just want to thank you for spending an hour or so speaking with me.
You bet. Thank you so much for asking me.